We were on a quick father-daughter camping trip at Trillium Lake near Mount Hood in Oregon, our little blue tent breathing in the cold as if it had lungs. I was poking the fire ring with a stick when my phone lit up. The first photo showed our Portland driveway dusted with black ash. The next showed what used to be my mother's quilts, pearls fused into glassy drops. Then came the message from my stepmother, Lydia Crane. I burned it all. It was clutter anyway. Tell your dad to grow up. My hands went cold even though the flames were warm on my shins. I tasted cedar the way I used to when my mother, Ellen Reed, tucked sachets into drawers. I could almost see her careful hands smoothing a quilt on the bed in our Hawthorne house. The images on my screen kept coming. Lydia had added laughing emojis and a photo of our empty mantle. My dad, Jonathan Reed, was asleep in the tent. I listened. To his steady breathing, then the distant lap of water on shore, and felt something tilt inside me. I whispered Mom, because speaking her full name felt like opening a window. I crawled into the tent and shook my dad's shoulder. He blinked at the light of the phone, squinted, and tried to sit up. His face changed. That easy color drained out of him. He pressed a hand to his chest and said my name in a thin voice I had never heard. I called 911 and the dispatchers, calm syllables braided with the hissing of the lantern. The ranger met us at the trailhead. By the time the helicopter thumped over the pines, my heartbeat felt like it was trying to keep time with the rotors. The flight nurse clipped a monitor to his finger and spoke with my dad the way good people speak to frightened animals. She said they were taking him to Oregon Health and Science University in Portland. When they lifted, his eyes found mine. I told him I would drive behind. I packed the tent by feel, shoved everything into the hatchback, and took Highway 26 west. Every spruce along the shoulder looked like a figure in a dark coat. I kept one eye on the gas gauge and one on the clock and kept telling the dashboard that he would be fine. Sandy, boring, Gresham. The town slid by like blunt beads on a wire. I bought $38 of gas on a card I barely remember pulling from my wallet, and a cashier with pink hair handed me a bottle of water and said to breathe. I tried Lydia again. Straight to voicemail. Then a new text landed from her, in the family thread. You two should have let go years ago. This house is mine now. My hands shook on the wheel, and I thought about how ownership is not always recorded on paper. Sometimes it is recorded in the way you remember the creak of a stair. The emergency department at OHSU was all bright light and steady motion. An intake nurse took my dad's name and looked at me as if she knew what kind of night this was. They rolled him past a sign that said Cardiac Cath Lab and told me to wait. I sank into a molded chair that had a little ledge for a paper cup and called Aunt Susan. She said she was leaving her house right then. I called my cousin Ben in Seattle and my mother's sister Ruth, who always sounds like she is humming. When I hung up, a cardiologist in Navy scrubs introduced herself as Dr. Megan Cartwright. She said it was a heart attack, a serious one, but not the kind that always wins. They had placed a stent. He was stable. The words did not rise like balloons. They settled like a weight in my ribs, and it felt good to carry them. A clerk asked for insurance information, and I fumbled my dad's worn card from my wallet. There was a moment when she asked about a deposit for the room, something routine, and I put down my card and authorized up to $250 without thinking. Money had never felt less real and more necessary at the same time. She printed a wristband. For me, that read authorized visitor, and I wore it like it might protect us both. The ICU eats time and then gives it back in small, careful bites. Monitors ticked like steady metronomes. The window looked out over the dark river, and the reflections of the city made a ladder in the water. A nurse named Jamal told me I could see my dad for 5 minutes. My dad's face was gray at the edges, but his eyes were bright and bewildered. He squeezed my fingers. I told him I had the photos saved. I told him none of it would be swept under the rug. He mouthed water, and I dipped a sponge and touched it to his lips. The gratitude in his eyes cracked something open and let the air back in. The texts kept buzzing. Lydia did not answer calls. She posted instead, as if she were narrating a house fire to a room full of people who did not know the names of our doors. She wrote that grief had turned us into hoarders, that she was clearing space so life could move forward, that she had invested in new countertops and deserved a home that reflected her taste. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then I turned the phone face down. I was not going to let a feud decide the story of my mother, who once painted the dining room overnight and hid a tiny blue heart behind the built-in because she said a house needs secrets. Sometime near dawn, the air changed. The ICU lights were still the same, but the world outside them seemed to exhale. I walked down to the vending machines and bought a coffee that tasted like metal and hope. I wrote a list on a receipt. Call Aunt Susan with updates. Find a way to secure the house. Check homeowners' insurance. Change passwords. I added one more line and underlined it twice. Do not let anyone call Mom's life clutter. The words were not dramatic. They were a promise written in bad pen in a quiet hallway, and they steadied me more than any poster that said courage. When the sun came up, it made a thin stripe on the floor and lit the dust like confetti. My dad slept. Dr. Cartwright rounded, again, and said the next 24 hours mattered most. I thanked her and meant it. I went outside for the first time since the helicopter and stood in the parking garage where the wind smelled like concrete and rain. The payment kiosk told me the fee for the night was $16. I paid it and kept the receipt because ordinary life was still insisting on itself, and that felt like a strange gift. I called our neighbor in Portland, Mr. Ortiz, who keeps a spare key in a coffee can in his shed. He said he would check the locks, and I told him I would reimburse him for any damage. He said not to worry about the money. People say that when they are kind, it feels like a blanket on their shoulders. I texted Aunt Susan the room number. Then I sat with my dad and watched the green blip on his monitor climb and fall like a tiny mountain range. I thought about the quilts, about pearls that melted into hard tears, about the way a house carries a family, the way a good boat carries weight without complaint. Before the end of visiting hours, my dad opened his eyes again. He looked at me and tried to smile with all the wires in his way. I told him we would deal with Lydia when he could walk. I told him the house would not be a stage for anyone else's idea of who we were. He nodded, a small, careful motion, and it felt like closing a clasp. I pressed my forehead to the window and said hello to the city I had driven through in the dark. The chapter was not over, but the worst sentence had a period now, and I could live with that. While my dad slept, the hospital worked the way a good orchestra works, each small sound creating a larger calm. Carts rolled softly along the hall. A monitor ticked in a steady rhythm. Someone laughed once at the nurse's station, a small sound that felt like a light switching on. I sat in the chair by the window and stared at the ceiling tiles until the pattern slowed my pulse. The quiet made room for a memory that arrived in whole pieces, as if it had been waiting behind a door. It was Thanksgiving in our cedar-shingled Craftsman in the Hawthorne district of Portland. The house smelled like nutmeg, butter, and coffee, with a thin line of wood smoke sneaking in from the chimney. We had only lived there a year when Lydia married my dad. She arrived with copper pans that caught every bit of light, and with a way of moving through a room that made me feel like the room was being judged. That holiday, the dining table wore my mother's linen and the good plates with tiny blue rims. Aunt Susan sliced pumpkin pie and told the story of my mother learning to bake by reading recipes out loud until the words turned into muscle memory. Uncle Henry brought up the weekend my mother painted the dining room in one sprint, a brush in each hand, music up, windows open to the November rain. He reminded us of the tiny blue heart she hid near the baseboard inside the built-in, because she said a house should know it is loved. Cousin Lily stood at the pantry door and traced the pencil marks that showed our heights through the years, crooked lines and dates and initials. The whole table turned into a map of my mother and the rooms that held her. I watched Lydia watch us, and I felt the temperature of the space shift by 1 quiet degree. Lydia smiled, but the smile had corners that did not soften. She twirled her fork and said the word shrine as if it were a joke, then took it back with a laugh that did not sound like a laugh. My dad reached for her hand and said, Ellen would have wanted us all together, that love does not vanish, it only changes rooms. Lydia poured more wine and said it was unhealthy to live in a museum. She called the quilts old and the books dusty. She said we had too many photos of the same woman. After dessert, she opened the windows even though rain ran along the sills. She said the house needed air, as if air could erase a person. I wanted to defend my mother with sentences that cut cleanly. I saw my father's shoulders settle into the careful posture he used when he feared conflict would become a storm. I chose patience because I believe time teaches people how to be gentle inside rooms they did not choose. I told myself that grief makes sharp corners. I told myself that marriages need space to learn the shape of a house. That night, I closed the windows after everyone left and set the copper pans back on their hooks. I touched the pantry door and felt the grooves of pencil lead under my fingertips like braille. Back in the present, a night nurse came in and adjusted my dad's IV. She asked if I needed anything, and I surprised myself by saying that I needed to go home and see what was left. She said to leave my number at the desk, and she wrote it down in neat block letters. At dawn, I drove through wet streets toward our block. The driveway still smelled like smoke. The trash can beside the garage was filled with gray shards and what looked like pearls fused into glassy tears. The garage door was half open, the kind of crooked that suggested haste rather than a broken spring. Inside, the built-ins in the dining room were empty. The small blue heart my mother painted was scratched by something sharp, but still visible if you knew where to look. The mantel was bare. The box where we kept letters was gone. The pantry door was a wound. Someone had sanded off the pencil, lines until the wood looked scabbed and pale. I stood there and felt my jaw lock. It was not a dramatic feeling. It was a click, quiet and final, like the turning of a key. On the kitchen counter, a note lay under the salt shaker. Lydia had written it in large loops. "This place needs to be mine if I am going to stay. You and your dad have to stop clinging to a dead woman." I read it twice and set it down as if it were a hot pan. The feeling that came next was not rage. It felt like a ledger. Lines had been crossed and I could see every entry. It was the kind of clarity that arrives when you finally decide to count what has been taken. I started with the practical. I took photographs of every emptied shelf and the trash can with its ashes and beads. I opened the hall closet and checked my mother's maple dresser. The top drawer still held winter scarves, but the letters were gone. I walked room to room, speaking softly to the house because that was how I had always moved through it. In the laundry room, I found a stack of folded towels that smelled like smoke and lemon cleaner. On the back porch, I found a grocery bag of things Lydia had not bothered to decide about. Inside were a silver picture frame with the glass cracked, a ceramic bird my mother kept on the windowsill, and a handful of buttons that had fallen loose from a tin. I saved all of it because the line between treasure and trash is not for strangers to draw. I called Mr. Ortiz next door. He climbed the fence with the ease of a man who has spent years in gardens. He offered to swap the locks, and I told him I would pay whatever it cost. He said to relax and let him help. He took the busted key cylinder to his workbench and returned with a replacement that clicked into place with a clean sound. I wrote down his time and told him I would bring cash by later. On the driveway, I swept the last of the ash into a bag and tied it tight. I did not know what should be done with the remains of what was stolen, but I knew they did not belong in the open air. Before I left, I walked to the dining room and sat at the table. The table remembered more than any of us. It remembered my mother's elbows when she leaned in to tell a story, the sound my father made when he stopped laughing and tried to look stern, and the way Aunt Susan tapped a ring against her glass when she wanted attention. The grain of the wood felt warm under my hands. I closed my eyes and saw Lydia open those windows on Thanksgiving, rain coming in, air refusing to erase anything that mattered. I told the table that I was sorry. Then I told it that I was finished apologizing for loving what loved us. I returned to the hospital before noon with a bag of clean clothes for my dad and a face that I hoped looked steady. He woke and searched my expression for bad news. I told him the house was secure and that I had photographs. He asked about the pantry door, and I nodded. His breath hitched in his chest, and for a moment I thought about lying. Then I did not. He closed his eyes and listened as I reminded him of the Thanksgiving with the copper pans and the blue heart behind the baseboard. He said Ellen would have laughed at the windows being open in the rain. He said jealousy is a kind of hunger that eats its spoon. When he slept again, I sat with my notebook and wrote to Aunt Susan. I attached the photos and asked her to save them in case my phone failed. I told her I would not speak to Lydia directly for a while. I would speak to facts. I would speak to people who could help. I looked up the number for a locksmith, then saved it even though Mr. Ortiz had already fixed the lock, because I had learned that preparation is a form of kindness to your future self. I looked up homeowners insurance and bookmarked the claims page. I did not yet know everything that Chapter 3 would require, but I knew the table had taught me something. In that chapter, memory is not a shrine, and it is not a museum. It is a living thing that asks us to keep telling the truth, even when the room smells like smoke. My dad was discharged 5 days later with a plastic bag of prescriptions, a follow-up scheduled, with Dr. Cartwright, and a soft gray sweater that made him look younger and older at once. The nurse went over the warnings while I wrote them down on a notepad I had been carrying like a passport. No heavy lifting, low salt, watch for chest pain, call if anything feels wrong. We drove home slowly across the bridges into Portland. The sky had that late afternoon color that looked like it was washed in milk. When we pulled into the driveway, Lydia stood in the doorway with a mug of coffee as if she had been timing our return. She did not ask about the ICU. She did not ask if he had slept or if he was afraid. She glanced around the living room the way realtors glance, one eyebrow lifted at the cleared shelves, and asked if we would be hiring a cleaning service now that the house was livable. My dad reached for the banister. I stepped between them before I knew I had moved. I said, "You burned my mother's things." She took a sip and said, "Your mother is gone, and it was all clutter." She tapped the quartz countertops she had chosen and said she had invested her money in the kitchen, that this house was as much hers as his, that she had already told the family what we were like to live with. Then she tilted her head and said a word I will never forgive. Hysterical. My dad's face changed. Not the color this time, but the muscles under the skin. He sat down on the stairs in a careful, slow motion that spoke a language I did not want to hear. I put a hand on his shoulder and felt the tight drum of his heart. That was the end of the conversation. I told Lydia we would speak through counsel from that point forward. I opened my laptop at the dining table and called a family lawyer in Portland, Marta Evans, who had been recommended by a friend from my office downtown. Her retainer was $5,000. I paid it from my savings without telling my dad the exact number. Peace of mind costs what it costs, and I would work weekends if I had to. Marta's office in the Pearl District sat above a bakery that smelled like almonds and sugar. The conference room table had a glass bowl of pens and a view of brick and sky. Marta wore a navy dress and a calm that did not ask for attention. She started with direct questions. Did we have photos of the burned items? Yes. Did Lydia contribute to the mortgage or the down payment? No. Were the destroyed items inherited from Ellen? Yes. Was there a prenuptial agreement? Yes, a short document that kept the house as separate property. Did Lydia have a key to a safety deposit box? No. Had Lydia contacted us since the ICU? Only to insult. Marta nodded as if placing small stones in a straight line. She filed an emergency order to prevent further destruction and scheduled a petition for a protective order. Her voice felt like a handrail on a steep set of stairs. By the end of the day, Lydia had hired an attorney, a man named Patrick Nolan, who faxed a letter that used words like equitable, contribution, and emotional distress. The letter read like a performance. Meanwhile, Lydia posted cropped photos to relatives in Seattle and Denver and told a story in which I sounded like the arsonist, and my father sounded like a man trapped by a controlling daughter. It is strange how lies can travel faster than facts in families that live in other area codes. Aunt Susan stayed solid and called me every evening. Cousin Lily, who has never believed in letting silence win, showed up with sandwiches, a cordless drill, and a small hammer to help reinstall the pantry door trim. We worked without talking much, and the house seemed to steady itself with every screw. Stress gnawed at my dad the way winter gnaws at a garden. He tried to sleep, and could not. His cardiologist warned that litigation is hard on the body, that even small arguments can steal rest. I built a schedule on a yellow legal pad. Morning walk around the block, medication at 8 and 9, time in the chair with a crossword, calls only routed through me. Marta adjusted her timeline and moved quickly on the protective order. The hearing was set for Tuesday. I wore the black suit I usually saved for interviews and funerals. Lydia arrived 10 minutes late with a fresh manicure and a frown that looked rehearsed. Judge Harper read the prenuptial agreement, the mortgage history, and the photographs. She studied a still frame of the driveway with ash and pearls that had fused into glassy drops. She asked a few questions, short and clear, then set the papers down. Her voice did not rise, and it did not fall. She said Lydia would vacate the property within 30 days. She said Lydia would not destroy, remove, or sell any item that remained. She said Lydia would surrender her keys to Officer Ramirez before leaving the building. It took less than 5 minutes to say what needed to be said. Power can look like a hammer. That day, it looked like restraint. Lydia laughed, a small surprised sound, and asked for time to make arrangements. The judge granted the 30 days that had already been outlined and scheduled a date for the marital dissolution. After that, there was nothing left to argue. In the hallway, I felt my shoulders drop an inch. Marta squeezed my hand once. My dad sat on a bench and put his head in his hands and cried the kind of quiet cry that has no show in it. I paid the second invoice, $3,200, and told myself I would rebuild my savings when we were safely on the other side. The next week was a lesson in practicalities. I changed the passwords on our shared utilities, added a camera to the front, porch for 119, and forwarded our mail to a small P.O. box near my office for $76 a year. I bought a locking file cabinet from a thrift store for $40 cash and filled it with copies of the prenup, the deed, the court orders, and a spiral notebook where I logged every call. I kept receipts for locksmith work and printed 2 sets of photos on matte paper at a shop downtown for $18, one for Marta and one for the insurance file. Boring can be holy when chaos has been trying to win. The smear campaign did not stop. 2 cousins reached out, one with curiosity and one with scolding. I sent both of them the same 3 bullet points in plain language. Prenup exists. The house is separate property. Items destroyed were from Ellen. I did not explain further, and I did not apologize. When Lydia sent a message through Nolan complaining about the tone of my emails, Marta replied with a single paragraph that quoted the protective order. The silence afterward felt like a quilt pulled up to my chin. My dad began to sleep again in longer blocks, first 2 hours, then 3. We walked our short route along the block and waved to Mr. Ortiz in his garden. He gave my dad a tomato from a vine that had made it through a cold snap. We ate it with pepper and salt and the kind of attention usually reserved for rare fruit. I reorganized the kitchen cabinets to minimize the sightlines that hurt. I kept the copper pans but moved them to a higher hook where they looked like objects and not arguments. I made a budget that balanced legal costs with groceries and gas. The numbers were tight and the tightness felt honest rather than frightening. 30 days sounds simple when a judge says it. In a house, 30 days is a lifetime. Lydia packed in bursts, sometimes with a friend, sometimes alone, always with the air of someone who believes theatrical silence is a kind of speech. The court had assigned a marshal to stand by during the final handover. Until that day, I kept taking inventory. I photographed the built-ins and the mantel, and the pantry door where the pencil marks now lived under a thin wash of new paint I had carefully added to seal what remained. Every night, I sat with my notebook and wrote a short entry, not about Lydia, but about what we had done right. Walked, ate soup, paid a bill, laughed once at a joke in the crossword that did not deserve it. On the evening before the move-out, I stood in the dining room again. The table held the stack of papers we would bring to the final check, copies for Officer Ramirez and Marta, with sticky notes labeled in my neat handwriting. The house was so quiet I could hear the clock in the hallway. I thought about the word hysterical and how it had been used to make me small. Then I thought about paper. Receipts, orders, deeds, photos. Paper can be flimsy. It can also be a shield when you hold it steadily enough. I pressed my palm to the wood where my mother's elbows had rested in stories I only half remember, and I promised her, and my dad, and the woman I was becoming, that this would not be a museum and it would not be a battleground. It would be a home that told the truth. The marshal arrived at 9 on a gray Tuesday and waited on the porch while Lydia packed. He stood with his hands folded, quiet and steady, the way people stand when their job is to keep edges from sharpening. Lydia moved through the rooms with a hard, bright gaze, like a shopper who had decided the store was beneath her. She filled 2 suitcases and 3 boxes. Clothes first, then the copper pan she loved to polish, then a jewelry case that clicked shut like a verdict. In the dining room, she paused at the empty built-ins and the scuffed spot near the pantry door where our pencil marks used to climb. "Have fun with your museum," she said. I did not answer. The marshal collected her keys, checked his list, and nodded to me. When the door latched behind them, the house settled, and the silence felt like a clean sheet. My dad slept for an hour on the couch, the soft gray sweater pulled up to his chin. I brewed tea that smelled like lemons and told the clock to move kindly. Marta called at noon with the voice I had come to trust. The divorce decree had been signed that morning. No spousal support, no lien on the house, and a clear note from the court about the destruction of property and the existing prenuptial agreement. I repeated the words for my dad when he woke. He put both hands on the kitchen counter and laughed. Not loud, only pure, and his face looked 10 years younger for a breath. We talked about staying, but we did not. The craftsman had a good heart, but every room carried a shadow that no paint could soften. I called Dana Pierce, a realtor I knew, from a volunteer fundraiser. She walked through the house and spoke in the practical language of square feet and comparables. She suggested a list price of $655,000, polished floors, and white flowers by the porch. I scrubbed baseboards and patched nail holes. Dana staged the living room with a light rug, and the built-ins glowed the way they do when a room is treated gently. The listing went live on a Friday. By Sunday, a young couple from Eugene had toured twice, held hands in the dining room, and made an offer at $640,000 with $10,000 in earnest money and a 30-day close. They promised to keep the tray A, built-ins, and the little blue heart my mother had painted behind the baseboard. I accepted. Dana smiled in a way that made the word future feel like a real thing you could lift. Packing is a time machine and a ledger at once. The last afternoon, I pulled the top drawer from my mother's maple dresser, the one we had rescued from smoke with a lemon oil bath, and something thumped against the back panel. A thin envelope slid free. Blue ink on the front. Careful loops. That unlocked a room inside me. For Caroline someday? I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor between boxes and let the house be the only witness as I opened it. My mother's handwriting was steady as a road that knows where it is going. She wrote about the day she and my dad bought the Craftsman, how the keys felt heavy in her palm, and how the front door stuck a little when the air was damp. She wrote about love as a practice, not a prize, and about grief as a tide that recedes and returns, but always leaves shells worth keeping. She wrote that memories can live in objects, but they live better in people. If anyone ever tries to make you choose between the past and the future, choose the truth, she wrote. The truth holds both. She told me to be kind to my father when he grew quiet, to plant herbs by any front door I ever loved, and to keep a spare key with a neighbor who knows how to show up. I pressed the pages to my chest and felt a calm that was not the same as relief. It was the feeling you get when a lie finally loses its echo. I drove to my dad's follow-up appointment at Oregon Health and Science University with the letter tucked in a file folder between discharge papers and receipts. The waiting room had a view of the river. I read the letter to him slowly. He cried without embarrassment, then smiled the way he used to smile when he fixed a leaky faucet in 20 minutes and called it a small miracle. Ellen always did have good timing, he said, and the nurse, who had been pretending not to listen, touched my shoulder in quiet agreement. Closing day arrived clear and bright. We signed a stack of papers that smelled faintly of toner. The title? Agent slid a cashier's check across the table and told us what would hit the account after fees and taxes. The numbers were exact and unemotional. The check felt heavier than it looked. I paid the movers $200 and tipped them in cash because they carried our lives down the steps without nicking a single corner. We said goodbye to Mr. Ortiz in the driveway. He hugged my dad carefully and slipped a small envelope into my hand. Inside was a copy of our old fence code and a sprig of rosemary wrapped in paper. For luck, he said. You will make any place feel like home. We chose Bend, Oregon. The air felt cleaner. The mountains sat close like sturdy company, and the pace matched the way my dad and I had begun to move. We found a small Cape Cod on a quiet street with a sloped roof and windows that liked morning light. The price was $425,000. We used cash from the Portland sale and my savings. Closing costs came to $6,900. I wrote the numbers in my notebook and felt something align inside me. On our first night, we ate sandwiches on the kitchen floor and listened to the unfamiliar hums that belong to any new house. Aunt Susan drove over 2 days later with a flat of herbs. She planted rosemary by the porch and thyme near the steps, then handed my dad a trowel and told him this was rehab for the soul. Lily arrived that weekend with a little box of paints. She opened the linen closet, ducked inside, and left a tiny heart in the corner where only the curious will ever see it. Not a shrine, she said. Only a hello. We both laughed, then both wiped our eyes. I kept the copper pans, moved them to a single hook, and decided they were objects now, not arguments. I taped my mother's letter into a frame and set it on my dresser until I could find a place where sunlight would not fade the ink. Life arranged itself into a new rhythm. I took a job at a local nonprofit that helps renters fight predatory leases. The salary was modest, but the work felt like standing in the right doorway at the right time. My dad joined a cardiac support group that met on Wednesdays in a church basement. He learned to breathe through fear, to count to 10 before answering, to nap without apology. On Saturdays, we walked the path along the Deschutes River and counted dogs, which is a game that heals more than it should. Our neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, brought over blueberry muffins and told us the trash day schedule and the names of the best hardware clerks in town. Every kindness fits into the house like a well-cut board. Money became honest again. I built a new budget that included groceries, gas, and a line for small pleasures like fresh flowers and library finds. I set aside $200 a month to rebuild savings. When Marta's final invoice arrived for $1,150, I paid it with gratitude and sent her a card that said only "thank you for holding the paper shield with me." She wrote back that it had been my steadiness all along. Some mornings I wake before light and hear the echo of a helicopter over pines that are not the pines from that night. I pour coffee and stand in the doorway of our new kitchen and read my mother's letter again. The lines feel different each time, the way rivers look different in new weather. The house answers with its small, steady sounds. A heater is clicking on. A clock moving forward. A bird is testing the gutter. I think about the words people use to cage me. Hysterical. Hoarder. I think about the words that set me free. Daughter. Witness. Builder. We have a new table. It is simpler than the old one and bears no history yet, only rings from cold glasses and the scratch of a pen when I pay bills. On Sunday nights, I set it with my mother's plates, the ones with the blue rims, and my dad tells a short story about Ellen. Not a museum piece, not a speech, only a memory that sits down with us like a friend. We pass the bread and the pepper and laugh when we forget where we left the butter. The past sits at the table, so does the future. Truth holds both, exactly the way my mother promised. I keep the envelope that says, "For Caroline," in the top drawer of my dresser, the one that sticks when the air is damp. I open it less often now, which does not mean I love it less. It means the words have gone where they belong. They live in the way I lock the door and water the rosemary and call my father for dinner. They live in the way I tell the story, so it does not have to be rewritten by anyone who was not there. This is not a museum, and it is not a battlefield. It is a home. It is ours.